Mama and Jean, Part 1. Elves Running Loose in the Kitchen. In early April 1951, Mama's younger brother Gene, who'd be 20 in December, but had looked and lived like a grown man since he was 14, came for an unexpected visit. Mama was living in Rock Island, working at S.S. Kresge, a five-and-dime type department store that would eventually be called Kmart. It was the kind of place where the smell of fresh popcorn and penny candy mixed with the sharp tang of shoe polish and new fabric. Seeing Jean walk through the doors not long after the breakfast rush took her by surprise. She hadn't even gotten a chance to put on a fresh apron. She'd been cleaning up the mess the men in town made after standing in line to get their hands on her homemade blueberry pancakes and thick sliced maple bacon. And nobody made coffee like Mama. Her secret was adding just a bit of butter and a pinch of salt to the fresh grounds before perking. She had regulars who came in for breakfast as much for the coffee as for her company. "Jean, what in the world are you doing here?" she called, her voice pitched between shock and curiosity. Jean didn't answer right away. He just nodded toward her boss, Elton Fawkes, who sat at the end of the counter drinking a cup of Mama's brew. Hiring Darlene Barnhart to manage his lunch counter had been one of the best moves he made since being promoted to store manager 3 years earlier. She always made him look good. Didn't hurt that she looked so damn good doing it either. Profits had never been better. "Think you could get off early?" Jean asked, his voice lower than she expected. It wasn't like Jean to dance around his words, and the look in his eye told Mama all she needed to know. This was serious business. The past 6 months, Jean had been living in Grinnell with their mother and stepfather, Martin Hall. That was a good 2.5 hour drive on a sunny day, and this had not been one of those. Overnight, sleet and freezing rain hammered the roads, leaving slick ribbons of ice even after the sun came up. Mama slid her way into work that morning, and she figured it must have been worse in Grinnell, where winter always had a meaner bite. And yet, here Jean was, standing across the counter, his hair wet from the thawed frost, his coat carrying the damp, gritty scent of a long road behind him. "You drove all that way in this weather?" Mama asked, already knowing the answer. Jean just shrugged, as if that was beside the point. "You could say it's been weighing on me," he said, his hand running over the back of his neck like he was trying to rub away whatever thoughts were pressing on him. Mama's stomach tightened, but trying to stay calm, she was determined she wouldn't make too much of whatever Jean wanted to tell her. If someone was dead, she'd know by now. That couldn't be it. She told herself this over and over, even though her stomach was churning. Mama had been dreaming lately, and her dreams were never wrong. She didn't have a word for 'em back then, not precognitive or clairvoyant, like folks might say now, but she knew what they meant. She never liked dreaming because they never seemed to bring good news, just a warning that she needed to prepare for something. Whatever Jean was carrying, she figured it might be the thing her dreams had been trying to tell her. "Come back at 4:30 when I get off, and you can follow me home," she told him, her voice steady even though she was already counting the hours in her head. Mama managed the lunch counter and the soda fountain at Kresge's from 7 in the morning when the doors opened for breakfast till they closed at 3:30 in the afternoon, 45 minutes after the high school let out. That last rush of teenagers was nothing but chaos with milkshakes, French fries, and laughter loud enough to rattle the chrome stools at the counter. Her shift ended at 4:30, after she wiped down the last sticky table and locked the till. Walking into the back room where the employee lockers lined the wall, she slid the key, dangling on a chain from her waist, into the lock and swung the metal door open. She pulled off her apron and tossed it in the basket in the corner, where the laundry lady upstairs would pick it up. From the locker, she grabbed her hip-length swing coat, soft and familiar, and wrapped it around her. Tonight, she lingered a moment longer, taking her time as she slipped her arms into the sleeves and adjusted the collar. She knew, deep down, that everything was about to change. Sometimes her ability to feel into the future, if not actually see it, felt more like a curse than a blessing. By 5 o'clock, Mama was sitting at her kitchen table, her coat hanging on the rack by the door, and her hands wrapped tight around her coffee cup. Jean sat across from her, silent. The only sound was the tick of the wall clock, each second dragging on longer than the last. Bunny and Barney were downstairs with Willie Mae, the sweet old colored lady who took care of 'em while Mama worked. Willie Mae had supper ready for the girls and would get 'em bathed before she brought 'em back home, so Mama and Jean could have some time alone. Mama didn't know what she'd have done without Willie Mae. When she had to take an apartment in the colored side of town, it was a leap into the unknown. Mama hadn't had much choice, and Barney didn't make things any better. Money was tight, and she hadn't known what to expect when she took this place. Fear of judgment and shame had gnawed at her, but those fears faded quickly. Mama couldn't have landed in a better place if she'd been the richest woman in town. The folks here had hearts bigger in their pockets, and their kindness got her through some of the darkest days. They didn't just help her through the divorce. They helped her believe in herself again. Willie Mae especially. Her gentle hands and steady presence were a godsend, not just for the girls, but for Mama too. All right, Jean, I'm listening. What's so important that you had to come all the way from Grinnell to tell me about it? You might have just called, you know. Mama tried to sound casual, but her voice was tighter than she meant it to be. Working at the Greenfield Farm Co-op with Darrell since the start of the war, she never thought Jean would come back to Grinnell. In 1942, men in farming towns had gone off to live in army barracks and learn to fight Nazis. It was slim pickings in those days when it came to finding strong men who could do the work. So the co-op built their own barracks and started hiring teenagers. Jean and Darrell had jumped at the chance to quit school and start work instead. That was nearly 10 years past. Then 6 months ago, Jean showed up on their Mama and Martin's doorstep saying he wanted to come home. She never knew why he'd made that decision, but she thought she was going to hear about it now. Jean leaned in closer, his elbows on the table, like he was going to spill a secret in a room full of strangers. His voice dropped low, barely louder than the tick of the clock. You remember Darrell's oldest sister, Mags? Mama paused, her brow furrowing as she searched her memory. She couldn't place the name at first, and she told him so. Jean stopped short, realizing he had used the name only he called her. Everybody else knew her as Maggie or Magdalena. I mean Maggie. You remember? Darrell's sister, Magdalena. It's been a while, but I know who you mean, she said slowly. Her mind drifted back to that night 6 years ago, the one she hadn't thought about in ages, but she would not forget. We met at the county fair the night you and Darrell disappeared. You were supposed to meet Barney and me at the main gate at 10 o'clock. It was nearly midnight before I found you two in the auction barn, playing cards and taking money from people who should have known better. Jean laughed, thinking back on what he'd done, his deep blue eyes sparkling. Mama tried to stay stern, but her voice softened as the past tugged at her. You scared me to death, Jean. It wasn't funny. Still, the corners of her mouth were already curling into a smile, even as she tried to scold the handsome boy sitting across from her. You always did whatever you pleased, and it never seemed to catch up with you either. The rest of us can't get away with a gall darn thing, but you never have to pay the piper. The sparkle in his eyes dimmed a little when she said that last bit, but she didn't notice the change. Not then, anyway. You might think Mama was about to get mad, but instead she threw her head back and laughed out loud. Her brother joined in, their laughter filling the room as the past rose up between them, as vivid as if it happened yesterday. Barney was taking me to the Powesheik County Fair to celebrate my 17th birthday. You were 13 going on 31 and determined to go along, Mama mused. I was a brat, right? He admitted, leaning back in his chair as his cheeks went pink. To say the least, Mama shot back, her brow furrowing like she was about to scold him, but her smile never faded. Looking at her little brother had that effect. No matter how much trouble he caused or how grown he pretended to be, there was just something about this kid. Their shared memory from 1944 opened wide, pulling them back to what felt like a much simpler time. Gene wasn't 14 yet, but he already thought he was grown. Their mama figured it'd be a good idea for him to tag along with his older sister and this new fella who'd been hanging around since Darlene met him at the Maid-Rite stand. Said he could keep an eye on things. What a joke that turned out to be. When Granny shoved a whole dollar in Gene's pocket to pay for food and rides, Mama knew two things for sure. There'd be no telling that boy to stay home, and no keeping him next to her once they got to the fair. And sure enough, as soon as they got there that afternoon, Gene took off like a shot with Darrell Jensen, the boy he'd been thick as thieves with since they were toddlers. The two of them had met at the livestock auction in Grinnell, back when they were still learning to walk, and they hadn't parted ways since. "You meet us back here at the gate at 10 o'clock, Gene. You hear me?" Mama yelled after him, her hands on her hips as he ran off with his friend and disappeared into the crowd. Gene didn't stop, didn't turn around, just threw his hand up in the air, signaling he'd heard. That was good enough for Mama. She nodded to herself, feeling satisfied, at least for the moment. By 9 o'clock, at the end of a day filled with carnival food, rides, and sideshows, Barney guided Mama toward the Ferris wheel. It would be their last ride of the night. As they approached John Andrews, the ride operator, Barney leaned in close and slipped a 50-cent piece into his hand. "Give me a minute at the top with my girl before you bring us down the last time," he whispered with a wink, his voice low enough for only John to hear. John looked at the coin in his hand, then back at Barney, an old friend from way back, and nodded his head. Barney had a plan to take Mama to the top of the world that night and kiss her for the first time ever. He could already see it in his mind. The view of the fairgrounds spread out below, the lights blazing, the music drifting up from the bandstand. It felt like the perfect place to make his move. Tonight, he thought, he'd finally get to take a drink. They were just 2 ticket holders from the front when Darrell's older sister found Mama. Stepping up to the front of the line, she asked, "Are you Gene Smith's sister? I'm Maggie Phillips. I'm looking for my brother Darrell. He and Gene ran off together hours ago, and I need to find him. We got to go home." Mama blinked, taking in the girl who'd just cut in line without so much as a "by your leave." Mama knew who Darrell was, but she'd never met this girl. She looked to be near Mama's age, likely just a few years older. There was a wedding band on her left hand, but she had the look of a woman who'd seen more in her years. Experience hung on her like perfume. This blonde-haired beauty stood there, her eyes sharp and clear, with a look that said she was on a mission and wasn't about to be stopped. "I'm Darlene. Gene's going to meet me at the gate at 10 o'clock. Maybe Darrell will be with him," Mama offered. Maggie muttered, "Damn it," low enough for most not to notice, but Mama's head snapped up when she caught her swear. It only took a moment for Mama to size her up. Maggie wasn't like most girls she knew, and Mama kind of liked that about her. There was something bold and unapologetic about the way she stood there, her hands on her hips like she owned the space. "Well, if you see him, tell him to meet us at the car," Maggie said, her voice firm, like she wasn't asking, just telling. Mama wasn't expecting what came next. Maggie leaned in and started telling the rest of her story, talking like they were already friends. Mama was taken aback. This kind of thing didn't happen very often in the part of the world she lived in. Strangers didn't just walk up and start spilling their lives like this. But here Maggie was, talking like it was the most natural thing on earth. "My husband and I are leaving first thing in the morning, heading back to St. Pete. That's in Florida. Walter's in the Army," she said, her voice steady, but with a flicker of something underneath. "We live down there for now, but when this damn war is over, I guess we'll be coming home." "You ever been to Florida?" Mama could tell Maggie didn't mean for her to answer, so she just kept on listening. "I love that place. It's the warmest piece of calm earth I've ever lived on." Then, almost like she didn't mean for Mama to hear, Maggie muttered under her breath, "I'd have a stay down there if I could." Mama nodded, keeping her face neutral, though the words stuck with her. "I'll make sure Darrell gets the message if I see him," she said. Without another word, Maggie turned on her heel and marched off, cutting through the crowd like she owned the whole fairgrounds. Mama watched her go, a tiny smile playing at her lips. I like that girl, she thought to herself. Coming back to the present at her kitchen table, Mama shook her head and said, "You and Darrell were off playing poker, trying to give both of your big sisters a heart attack. I didn't think we were ever going to find you after you didn't meet Barney and me at the gate like we planned. You know, I could get mad at you all over again right here sitting at this table." Her smile wasn't quite as broad as it had been minutes ago. She leaned back slightly, her fingers tapping against the edge of her coffee cup. "I met Maggie that one time and never saw her again. Of course, I know who Darrell is. His grandparents lived in Grinnell, not too far from Dad and Jeanette's place, right?" Mama rarely spoke about their father and the woman he lived with now, but when she did, the hurt in her voice was unmistakable. Smitty, their dad, lived with Jeanette for nearly 7 years, shaming their family while he begged Granny to give him a divorce. They stayed in Grinnell the whole time, not too far from the rest of the family. It wasn't until late in 1945, after Granny finally let go of the hope he'd ever come home, that she signed the papers and gave Smitty what he wanted. Mama would never forgive him for what he put their family through. Even after Dickie Lee died, the wound that tore through their family didn't seem to touch him. Dad just went on like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't cracked wide open. But Jean always saw their dad as larger in life. Smitty had a way of commanding attention wherever he went, like the rules didn't apply to him, 'cause he didn't care if they did. To Jean, their dad was a mix of hero and rebel, the kind of man who knew how to charm a room and get away with just about anything. At the pool hall, Smitty's world came alive. Jean could see it in the way men tipped their hats and laughed at his jokes, or how Jeanette would lean in close to listen, her lipstick bright against the dim, smoky air. Smitty wasn't just a father in those moments. He was a king holding court, and Jean was proud to be his right-hand man. Their dad's final goodbyes to Iowa came just after the new year in 1946, when he and Jeanette left for California. They stopped in Arizona long enough to get married on January 9th. After that, Smitty finally had the good sense to never return to Grinnell. He settled in Los Angeles County, making a living as a house painter. When he left Iowa, Mama thought she'd never see her dad again. His absence wasn't anything new. He'd been gone in every way that mattered for years. But this time, it felt final. But it wouldn't be.